It's the year 2024, and people are still having the debate about R and Python. Which one is better? Which one should you learn if you're getting into data science? And who's using what? Well, watch till the very end because I'm going to cover all of those things. I'm Richard, and this is Richard on Data. So 4 years ago, I did a video on exactly this topic. I overviewed the popularity and the capabilities of both of these languages, as well as the relative learning curve for beginners. And the conclusion that I came to was that if you absolutely must pick one, pick Python, but ultimately you should pick one of the two, get really good at it, and then move on and learn the other. Well, things change fast, and 4 years is a relatively long period of time. So I'm going to go over all these things again. And you'll see if after 4 years my recommendation has shifted at all. Before I do that, 70% of you who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so if you aren't, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Then take just a fraction of a second to smash the like button for the YouTube algorithm. So let's start by talking about who's using which language and which one is the most popular, both inside and outside of the data science world. This is going to depend on the methodology that you're using as well as who you're asking. But the most common index used for measuring the popularity of programming languages remains the TIOBE index. And the results for this in January of 2024 are pretty fascinating. So the TIOBE index works by looking at search queries across a variety of search engines, as well as the number of courses and third-party vendors for that language. That's essentially used as a proxy of the language's prevalence and popularity. And you'll see that Python is quite literally the most popular programming language in the world. And where does R stack up? Well, it's not even close. When I did this video before, it was sitting at number 18. But today, again, this is in January of 2024, it's sitting at number 23, just a little bit above SAS. Now, it's important to take all of this with a grain of salt because it's not a totally apples to apples comparison. Reason being, Python is a general purpose programming language, whereas R was literally built by statisticians for other statisticians. So it's almost exclusively used for data science and statistics. And there's also some indices out there that give somewhat different results. An example of one of those would be PyPL, that is the Popularity of Programming Language Index, not to be confused with PyPI, which is the Python Package Index. This one is strictly created by analyzing how often tutorials for that language are searched for on Google. And you'll see again, Python sits way at the top and it's not particularly close, not surprising. But R is all the way up at number 6 on this one, which is very different from number 23. So it's easy and frankly quite fair to look at these things and think, okay, I don't really care. What are people actually using in their jobs? Or what should I learn so that I maximize my own chances of getting a job? So it was surprisingly hard to find recent, reliable analyses that broke down job listings for these technologies, specifically for data science. The best thing that I could find was Anaconda's mid-2022 State of Data Science report. So Anaconda does this report every year, and it's a fairly comprehensive methodology. They're surveying people from all around the globe, from different industries, in some different titles, but also people at different stages of their careers. So Anaconda's findings shouldn't be super surprising. What they find is 31% of the survey participants always use Python, 27% of them frequently use it, and 22% sometimes use it. You add that up, and that's 80% of participants using Python at least some of the time, if not all of the time. So that's absolutely enormous. When you look at R, by contrast, though, 7% of participants always use it, 19% frequently use it, and 28% sometimes use it. That's a total of 54%. So that's definitely quite a significant gap between the two. Interestingly, rounding out the middle there is SQL, with 16%, 26%, and 29% in those respective categories, making up a total of 71%. So if you take one thing away from this, Python is used even more than SQL now. So I hope I've established pretty clear and convincing evidence from both the indices as well as Anaconda's report that Python is used by far and away more than R is, and I really don't see that changing. To be fair, sometimes what people use is going to be influenced by what they learned in school, because you become comfortable with one technology and you might be reluctant to change to something else unless you have a job that forces you to. I can't find any up-to-date research on what colleges are teaching in the year 2024, but from my own experience as well as anecdotes from people I've talked to, it seems common that people use R when they're in statistics and data analysis courses, and they learn Python when they're in programming and computer science courses. But then suppose that you don't know either of them. One of the natural first questions you might ask is, which one of the two is easier to learn? This is honestly a highly subjective question, which there's a lot of disagreement and arguments for both sides on this. Personally, I found Python to be by far the more difficult of the two to pick up, but again, this is probably influenced by college experience. I personally did statistics programs for both my bachelor's and my master's, and I used R in quite literally every single course. So after a while for me, using R was as natural as breathing. When I learned Python, it was definitely a little more challenging to manage environments as well as packages and conflicts, so that was a major thing for me. But I have heard people make the exact opposite point. I've heard people pick up Python and they say it's the simplest and cleanest and easiest thing to use ever, but then they go to learn R and they find it abstract and weird. So it's really impossible to definitively say for you which one would be easier to learn unless you really firmly lean in one camp versus the other. That is, statistics background versus computer science background. And then for these two languages, what integrated development environment, or IDE, or text editor, are people using in 2024? Well, PyPL tracks this as well. PyPL finds that Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code are right at the top. And those probably represent a lot of people who use Python. Now, things like PyCharm and IntelliJ and Atom are pretty popular choices as well. Vim and Emacs are a little more old school. But then RStudio is almost the universal choice of environment for people who choose to use R. Maybe for me, it's sort of just old habits dying hard, but I've always found RStudio to be extremely easy to use and to learn. It's very good for keeping yourself organized. It's very flexible, and it just makes the whole programming experience a joy. So now let's talk about capabilities. And the dirty little secret here is that for both languages, there's usually at least one key package, sometimes multiple different packages, for doing almost anything that you want. That probably wasn't the case going back 4 or 5 years ago, but in 2024, it pretty much is. Let's take 2D visualization, for example. So with R, most people use ggplot2. For Python, a lot of people will use matplotlib. Sometimes people will use Seaborn, which is actually built on top of matplotlib. And sometimes, in both instances, people will use Plotly. Plotly has implementations for both R and for Python. R was literally built for statistics and statistical modeling, and it has functions in base R just for that. Python has stats models, and it's not quite there yet in terms of maturity and robustness to bugs and overall capabilities, but it's pretty close, and for the overwhelming majority of people, it'll get the job done. For your standard data manipulation type stuff, in Python, the most popular option by far and away is pandas, although the newer polars is catching up. And for R, you have the tidyverse, although data table is sometimes used for much larger data sets. Now this is a pretty weird comparison to me because pandas is a lot more self-contained, whereas the tidyverse is actually a pretty massive set of packages. So for instance, dplyr for things like joining or filtering or sorting. You have tidyr for reshaping. You have per for looping and iteration, the list goes on. Again, for most things that you're doing, either one of these two is going to be just fine. So I'll link to an article that details some of the differences between these two. It's generally agreed upon that pandas is a little bit more clunky looking, the syntax isn't quite as nice, and it's a little harder to pick up, but it is faster. Now let's talk about web apps. So those of you who've been following me for a while probably know that I'm a large fan of making interactive web apps, especially compared to blowing up your environment with a bunch of notebooks. And to me, the gold standard has always been Shiny. Shiny used to be a totally R native project, but there is now an implementation of it in Python. I haven't personally gotten the chance to use it yet, but just know that option does exist. And you also have tons of other options in Python for developing and hosting apps. So my personal favorite is Streamlit because it's so easy to pick up and to use. But you also have Dash, you have Bokeh, you have Flask, you have more options than you'll probably ever need. And then for machine learning, the most popular framework in Python is scikit-learn. For R, there used to be the Caret framework, but more recently that's sort of going by the wayside in favor of the newer and much easier to use tidy models. Now there's plenty of comparison tutorials out there showcasing the differences between the two. In general, I probably give a slight nod to tidy models just because it integrates so well with the overall tidyverse ecosystem. But overall, both of the two are pretty easy to use, and I find them both perfectly capable of doing almost anything that I want them to. Likewise, if you're building neural networks, you have all kinds of options in Python. PyTorch is a big one, as well as TensorFlow and Keras. You also have implementations of TensorFlow and Keras in R. So we've covered a lot of analysis type topics. But a question a lot, but understandably not all people have is, okay, what if you want to put something into a production environment? So I'll actually start with R on this one. R has the Plumber package, which can be used for generating and serving APIs using R functions. Then of course, you could always make and host Shiny apps. That's literally how I worked for a little over 1 year of my life. But overall, there's no question, you're going to find there's a lot more options and support for getting Python-based applications into production compared to R. You can orchestrate pipelines using a framework like Airflow, but then also, if you're deploying using one of the major cloud service providers, whether that's GCP or AWS or Azure, you'll find that those software development kits are mostly based around Python. And this consideration around production is probably the single biggest reason if you go to a major tech company or some kind of software development hub, you're much more likely to be working with Python than you are with R. However, and this is a point that I make in a lot of my videos, not everybody breaking into data science is necessarily interested in that specific brand of data science job. There are a lot of people out there, and you have to ask yourself, are you one of these people who's more interested in academia? And some people are more interested in the healthcare or biostatistics or pharmaceutical industries where R tends to be used the most. But I think it's beyond any question or reasonable doubt that in terms of total raw opportunities, you are going to have more of them out there with Python than you are with R. So again, if you're a total newcomer who doesn't know either of the two, that definitely needs to enter into your consideration when you're trying to pick which one to learn. Something I've heard people say for years, which I still hear to this day, is that Python is for production, whereas R is for research and prototyping. And I think there's certain truth to that. Now, one final comment I want to make is that no programming language lasts forever. It's totally possible that I come back in 4 to 5 years and make another video on this topic, and the takeaway is that both of these two languages are in precipitous decline, paving way for something else. But overall, my advice really hasn't changed that much from 4 years ago. If you have to pick between the two, I really do give the nod to Python, but there are definitely some subjective considerations here around things like learning curve for you, what you picked up in school, as well as what industries you're most interested in. And ultimately, I think what's most important is you pick one of the two, get really good at it, and then ideally move on and learn the other one. I personally found it pretty instructive to get really good at both of them and then try to study and understand the programmatic differences between the two, but that's really secondary after you get really good at least one of them. So thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button. If you didn't enjoy it, I guess you're free to hit the dislike button if that's what you want to do. Then leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Do you like R more? Do you like Python more? Do you like Julia more than either of those two? Let me know. Then I'll see you all in the not so distant future. Until then, Richard, on data.